You're listening to the Mad Fictional Imagination Playhouse audio presentation of Happy Valley Reapers by Ryan Scorpio Reese.
Chapter 5. Whispers on the Wind. The sheriff's dismissal hung over the Reapers like a storm cloud, but it was also liberating in its way. No constraints, no red tape. They were on their own now, free to follow leads without interference, but also without protection. That part lingered unspoken, weighing heavily on their shared silence as they trekked toward the creek. It was the last place they'd seen Ethan, the spot where everything had gone wrong. The woods around the creek had always been a refuge for them, a hidden world where the outside couldn't intrude. But now the familiar paths felt warped, the trees taller, their branches more gnarled, casting jagged shadows that seemed to reach for them. Even the air had changed. The usual freshness carried a faint metallic tang, sharp and cold, prickling at the back of their throats. "Anyone else feel like we're walking into a horror movie right now?" Punky muttered, kicking a loose rock into the underbrush. It skittered off into the dark with a hollow clatter. "It's just your imagination," Trigby said, though his tone lacked conviction. His eyes darted to the treetops, scanning for something he couldn't name. They reached the creek, but it was different too. The cheerful babbling of the water had been replaced by an eerie stillness. The surface was slick, glassy, reflecting only the faint silver light of the moon. On the bank, the dirt was churned and disturbed, as though the earth itself had been clawed at by desperate hands. Moz crouched by the disturbed ground, his dark eyes narrowing. He poked at the dirt with a stick, watching how the loose soil collapsed in on itself. "This isn't natural," he murmured, more to himself than the group. "What do you mean?" Juju asked, stepping closer. Her phone's flashlight cast a narrow beam across the ground, making the shadows seem deeper, darker. "I mean, someone did this on purpose," Moz said. He turned over a clump of earth with the stick, revealing a thin layer of ash beneath the surface, his lips pressed into a grim line. "It's like they buried something and then dug it back up." Squirt, hanging back near the trees, pointed suddenly. "There," he whispered, his voice taut. "Do you see it?" They followed his gaze to the base of a massive oak. The bark was scored with strange carvings, symbols that seemed to twist and shimmer in the dim light. Trigby stepped forward, tracing the patterns with his finger, careful not to touch them directly. "I've seen these before," he said, his voice tight with realization. "Around town, behind the old grocery store, on the abandoned water tower. I thought it was just kids tagging stuff, but—" "These aren't graffiti," Juju interrupted. Her flashlight beam steadied on the symbols, and she squinted at them through the lens of her phone's camera. "They're too precise, too deliberate." Mars straightened and dusted his hands off on his jeans. "What do they mean?" "I don't know," Trigby admitted, "but they're repeating. See here?" He pointed to a specific mark, an inverted triangle intersected by two jagged lines. "This one shows up 3 times. It's like a signature." Punky scoffed, her nerves leaking out as sarcasm. "Great. We're dealing with the Zodiac Killer's cousin. Love that for us." "Shut up, Punky," Squirt said, his voice sharper than usual. He rarely spoke up like that, and it was enough to make them all pause. His gaze stayed fixed on the creek. "This isn't a joke." Juju turned her flashlight toward the water, scanning its surface. "You're right," she said quietly. "Something's wrong here." The beam caught on something at the far edge of the creek, another patch of ash partially hidden by a tangle of bushes. The group moved cautiously toward it, the hairs on the back of their necks prickling, as if they were being watched. Moz reached the pile first, crouching again to examine it. He picked up a handful of the cold grey flakes, letting them sift through his fingers. "This isn't just ash," he said. "There's bone in it. Tiny fragments." The words hit them like a gut punch. Punky took a step back, her face pale. "Okay, what the actual hell is going on here?" Nobody answered. The silence was broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind, a sound that now felt more like whispers. Juju glanced at her phone, scrolling through the readings from her modified scanner. It wasn't just for show, she'd rigged it to detect unusual frequencies, anything outside the norm. "There's something here," she said finally. "A low-frequency hum. It's faint, but it's consistent, like a signal." Trigby frowned. "A signal for what?" Juju shook her head. "I don't know, but it's not natural." Moz stood, brushing his hands on his jeans again. "What we do know is this. Ethan didn't run away. Someone or something took him." "Do you think it's connected to these symbols?" Trigby asked, gesturing to the carvings on the tree. "Probably," Moz said. "But we're not going to figure it out standing here. We need to—" A sudden crack of a branch behind them made them all whirl around, hearts pounding. They scanned the shadows, but nothing moved. The woods were still, too still. "Let's get out of here," Squirt said, his voice barely above a whisper. For once, no one argued. As they made their way back to town, the weight of their discovery pressed down on them like a physical thing. This wasn't just about finding Ethan anymore. The creek, the symbols, the ash. It was all part of something bigger, something darker. And whatever it was watching them. They all felt it, and for the first time, they wondered if they were in over their heads. Chapter 6. The Librarian's Secret. The Happy Valley Public Library was an unassuming brick building nestled between a bakery and a hardware store, its weathered exterior belying the treasures within. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and lemon polish. A quiet sanctuary of knowledge that seemed untouched by the passing decades. It wasn't flashy or modern, no sleek design or glowing LED screens, just rows of mismatched wooden shelves crammed with books, some so old their spines had turned brittle and grey. For the Reapers, it was a place they rarely visited, but after hours of debate at Moz's garage, where their arguments bounced between heated whispers and strained silences, they'd agreed on one thing. They needed more information, and the library was their best shot at finding it. Mrs. Gable, the librarian, greeted them with her usual mixture of suspicion and tolerance. She was a petite woman with iron-grey hair and an aura of quiet authority. Her eyes perpetually narrowed, as if peering over invisible reading glasses. The Reapers weren't regulars, and Mrs. Gable had a way of sniffing out mischief like a bloodhound. "Back again?" she said, her voice as dry as the pages of an encyclopedia. "Try not to cause any trouble. This is a library, not a clubhouse." "We're just here to do research," Trigby offered, his tone overly formal as he avoided her gaze. Mrs. Gable arched a sceptical brow but said nothing more, retreating to her desk like a sentry guarding a fortress of forgotten knowledge. The Reapers gathered around a heavy oak table at the back of the library, far from the librarian's watchful eye. Punky pulled out the notebook where she'd sketched the strange symbols from the creek. She flattened the crumpled pages on the table, smoothing them with deliberate care. The crude drawings looked out of place against the polished wood, their jagged lines stark and unnerving. "I don't like this," Moz muttered, leaning over the table with his arms crossed. "The more we dig, the worse this gets." "That's because it is worse," Juju said, scrolling through her phone. She had connected to the library's spotty Wi-Fi, pulling up old scanned maps and historical documents from a few local archives. "Look at this." She turned the screen toward the group. The map was an antique, its faded lines barely legible. Overlaid in red were thin, intersecting lines that crisscrossed Happy Valley like a spider's web. "These are ley lines," Juju explained. "Energy pathways according to all the weird folklore and pseudoscience. And guess what? The creek is right on one of the intersections." "You're saying the symbols are connected to this energy?" Trigby asked, his voice sharp with curiosity. "I'm saying it's more than just random graffiti," Juju replied. "These ley lines have been tied to strange stuff. Disappearances, weird weather, even like heightened psychic activity. Whatever's going on, someone's using this energy on purpose." Trigby, who had been flipping through a thick leather-bound tome of local legends, paused. "It's not just the ley lines," he said, his finger tracing a passage in the book. "These symbols, they're part of an old ritual, like old, sacrificial stuff, The kind of thing people did when they thought they could bargain with gods or demons. The words hung in the air like a chill wind. Moz scowled, his jaw tightening. Sacrificial? You mean, like human sacrifices? Trigby hesitated before nodding. Possibly, but it's more likely symbolic now. Rituals evolve over time. Still, whatever they were doing at the creek wasn't random. And the ash? Punky asked. Her usual sarcasm was absent, replaced by a nervous edge. Moz sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It wasn't just any ash. I think it was incense, specific kinds used in rituals, but I can't say for sure what they were burning. Before anyone could respond, Squirt, who had been quietly flipping through another map, pointed to a faint marking. Here, he said, his voice soft but steady. This mansion, it's on an intersection too. They all leaned in to look. The Vesperwaite mansion, an abandoned relic of Happy Valley's wealthy past, sat directly atop one of the ley line crossings. Juju frowned. I don't like this. It's too much of a coincidence. It's not a coincidence, Trigby said, his tone dark. If they're using the ley lines for a ritual, then the mansion might be where it all started. Or where it's going to end, Moz muttered grimly. Their hushed conversation was interrupted by the soft creak of floorboards. Mrs. Gable had appeared beside them like a ghost, her hands clasped around a stack of books. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, flicked between the symbols, the maps, and the nervous faces of the reapers. You're digging in dangerous places, she said, her voice low but firm. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Punky was the first to recover, leaning back in her chair with forced nonchalance. Danger's our middle name, she said with a smirk. Mrs. Gable ignored the quip, her gaze settling on Trigby. Those symbols, she said, gesturing to the sketches. They're not just drawings. They're warnings. What do you mean? Trigby asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The Vesperwaites, she said, her tone heavy with unspoken history. Their family has ties to things this town has tried to forget. Occult practices, dark rituals, secrets buried so deep, even the cemetery doesn't know them. Why would they do this? Moz asked, his brow furrowed. Mrs. Gable's lips thinned. Power, control, the usual reasons. The Vesperwaite mansion isn't just a house, it's a key. And if you're smart, you'll leave this alone. But the Reapers weren't smart, or at least they weren't willing to back down. They had come too far to turn away now. We can't, Trigby said, his voice steady. Not after what we've seen. Mrs. Gable studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Then I suggest you tread carefully. The Vesperwaite family may be gone, but their shadows linger. And some doors are best left closed. As she walked away, her parting words echoed in the silence, a warning that felt more like a curse. The Reapers exchanged uneasy looks, the weight of their discoveries pressing down on them like a leaden sky. Whatever lay at the Vesperwaite mansion, they knew one thing for certain. It wasn't going to welcome them with open arms.
You've been listening to the Mad Fictional Imagination Playhouse audio presentation of Happy Valley Reapers by Ryan Scorpio Reese. If you've enjoyed yourself, consider hitting like and subscribe, and ring the notification bell to be alerted to new video and audio content when they drop. Also, if you would be so kind as to leave us a comment, we would greatly appreciate it. We need to let the algorithm know that this channel exists. Thanks for listening. Ciao, till next now.